The arrest of Atul and Rajesh Gupta sending shockwaves throughout the world. The two were nabbed in Dubai, but the South African Justice Department says although they have been arrested, it's unlikely that they will appear in a South African court anytime soon. Acting US Ambassador to South Africa, Heather Marriage, says this shows what can be done when countries work together.
I think it's an important show of international cooperation. I think it's good to see the Interpol mechanism for those who are accused of a crime in one country to be apprehended by another country to serve justice so that they can be adjudicated in a court of law here in South Africa and there can be an outcome to the accusations against them. So I think it's a good sign to see the Interpol system and those international police and justice cooperation taking place. And I look forward to seeing the outcome of the process, to see what South African courts make of the accusations and the indictments against them.
Professor Direta Adi from the University of Pretoria says the Guptas can still challenge their extradition back to South Africa.
The question is the processes in the UAE itself. There is an extradition treaty, of course, between South Africa and the UAE, but that extradition treaty really governs the relationship between South Africa and the UAE. Ultimately, once the government of the UAE decides that it wants to extradite, a different process is triggered, whereby the persons being sought, the Guptas, can now challenge the decision of the authorities for extraditions. It's clear to me that in this instance there is a desire by the authorities in the UAE to extradite. That's clear from a number of things. One, the extradition treaty between South Africa and the UAE was a long time in the making. But things ran very quickly at some point last year. You'll remember that the extradition treaty was signed, I think, around about June of 2021, and very soon thereafter there was the exchange of instruments to actually ratify the treaty so that it entered into force in July. That's very, very speedy, particularly taking into account that countries like the UAE don't generally like to extradite and don't generally like to conclude extradition treaties. The fact that there's been arrest is a further indication that there is a desire on the part of the authorities to extradite. But that's not enough. The desire on the part of the authorities in the UAE is not enough. All that it does is it triggers, as I said, this new process whereby the Guptas can now challenge the extradition process.
Would there possibly be a time frame on how soon then the extradition can continue and have the Guptas back in South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I was asked this question last year. I remember last year when the extradition treaty was signed, there was a lot of euphoria and people thought that the Guptas would be in the country immediately. And I remember saying, caution is required. It's a long process. And one never really knows how long it takes, because ultimately it depends on the domestic legal system of the state in which those that are wanted are held, right? So in our process, for example, it would take a very long time because you've got human rights requirements and all kinds of other rules that the persons that are sought can sort of throw at the authorities, keep challenging, particularly where the fugitives have deep pockets, because when you have deep pockets it means that you can hire big lawyers and big lawyers can find all kinds of loopholes and they can let the process drag on for long.
Meanwhile, the National Prosecuting Authority has confirmed that it is working now with the officials in the UAE to extradite the Gupta brothers, but the Justice Department is advising that this can be a lengthy process.
Extradition is not a process of tapping someone on the shoulder and say, come, let's go.
Yeah.
It is often a drawn-out process that happens in the courts, and it's most likely that this extradition process would not be any different from other extraditions. Even in our own country, we've seen some extraditions take a couple of years to really conclude.
Our India correspondent Rebecca Bandun also weighs in on this development. She reports that the Gupta brothers are still respected back home.
This story has been very widely covered in India. Of course, it's a big development with those two brothers being arrested. But questions are being asked here as well about why Ajay Gupta hasn't been arrested. And of course, they do have very strong connections, with India being they're of Indian origin. They do come from Saharanpur in North India, which is in the state of Uttar Pradesh. It's quite a nondescript place. They came from humble origins. Their father father was a small-time trader in Saharanpur, and it was in the 90s that the brothers moved over to South Africa to start their businesses. But they've maintained those strong connections with Saharanpur. We know that they've regularly visited the district over the years. They keep visiting India. Even after they left South Africa in 2018, they kept coming over to India. They were in Saharanpur. They travelled around the north of the country. They came over I remember Ajay Gupta was over for a pilgrimage in 2018. They also came over for family weddings. And they were also building a massive multi-million-dollar temple in their hometown of Saharanpur as well, which actually came under investigation. There have been investigations that have been going on in India as well over the past few years with suspicions or charges of potential money laundering. So the tax officials here have also been on their radar as well. But the brothers have certainly got those strong connections with the region. There hasn't been an official comment from the Indian government here, but certainly they're actually they're very well known in Saharanpur, and they have a lot of friends there, and people, even despite all the scandals, the corruption charges and everything, when I visited the location, people there still had a lot of respect for what the brothers had actually achieved over the years, having left India and built such big businesses in South Africa.